topic of this talk is science and spirituality, and some people think that religion or spirituality is outdated because now we have science, and in the age of science, we have no use for things like religion or spirituality. Science has the explanation for everything. So this talk is aimed at showing that actually the more that we discover through science, the more it actually points towards God. So um, this is, like I said, the first parts of the talk will be a little bit more important, but whenever the new people join, if they join, I can backtrack. But in science, there's an important concept called underdetermination of theory by the data. And what this basically means is that given a set of data or a certain set of evidence, there's any number of scientific theories that can explain that data. If you have some phenomenon, potentially endless ways of explaining why that theory is the case. So in science, or maybe more specifically philosophy of science, you have to have certain criteria by which you choose the most appropriate theory and the theory that is the best explanation of the data. And this is called abductive reasoning, or sometimes called inference to the best explanation. So there's basically three types of forms of reasoning. There's deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and abductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is like just a typical logical argument. If A, then B, A, therefore B. That's deductive reasoning, where a conclusion logically follows from its premises. There's also inductive reasoning, which is more probabilistic. So if A, then it is likely that B. A, therefore it is likely that B. That's a rough overview of those types of reasoning. In addition, so abductive reasoning is interesting because the way it usually works is you have different theoretical virtues, and you compare different theories or generate theories according to how many of these virtues they have or how well they do in terms of these various virtues. So in science, one of these virtues is parsimony or simplicity. So a theory that basically is more simple, like it posits the existence of fewer things, all else being equal, is probably going to be more accurate, or the scientific theory that fits best with the data, all else being equal, is probably going to be more accurate, or the scientific theory that has the most predictive fruitfulness, all else being equal, is going to be most accurate. So when scientists try to formulate theories, they do so by the basis of comparing which of these theories does the best in terms of these theoretical virtues. So with that in place, what I'm comparing is to maybe not scientific theories, but to metaphysical or philosophical positions. I want to compare naturalism, which is basically the belief that there's no like supernatural agents like God. It's roughly synonymous with atheism. And I want to compare theism, and specifically the theism of our tradition, the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. But the problem with comparing atheism and theism is that it's not quite like comparing two scientific hypotheses. These are philosophical positions, so we need theoretical virtues that are appropriate to philosophical positions. And I am still in the process of thinking about it a little bit more, but I have some in mind, and I think that these are good reasons why these are appropriate theoretical virtues for this type of comparison. So one is likeliness, which is basically if you have a set of data, like the theory with the most likeliness is the theory that the data is the most likely on. There's causal adequacy, which is, does a theory or a worldview, more specifically, actually, can it explain why certain things happen? Does it have the ability to account for how things are caused and how things can arise? There's also consistency with basic principles of rationality. And like one of these is that something is not just like ad hoc. And what ad hoc means is that you like posit something or you try to make a claim, but you make the claim in response to a certain piece of evidence, but you don't have any independent reasons for making that claim. So one example would be if you roll a dice, or yeah, if you roll a dice and you get like a 1 and then a 5 and then a 4 and then a 3 and then a 2, and you try to explain why that happened, by saying that, oh, there's actually like a magic demon that really wants these set of dice to occur. On one hand, it explains why you got those specific set of dice rolls, but it's a very ad hoc hypothesis. You have no reason for positing the existence of some demon just to explain some set of data. So that's like ad hoc. Um, and another basic principle of rationality is that whenever we have an explanation in terms of natural processes or the actions of an intentional agent, we should prefer that type of explanation rather than saying that something is like necessary or is like uncaused. So there are certain things that they don't really have a cause. Like we often say that God, he doesn't have a cause. He's the cause of all causes. Why does he exist? Well, he doesn't have a cause for his existence. He just exists. Some things you might have to explain like that. Like you can't explain why the number 2 is created, for example, or why 2 plus 2 equals 4. I mean, these are just like facts that they have no like cause to them. But in general, when we have some thing that we can explain in terms of the actions of an agent or the through unguided processes, we should prefer that rather than just saying something is like necessary or something is just like that without a cause for it. Then there's also consistency with established facts. If your worldview says something that's inconsistent with things that we already know, there's good reason to doubt your theory or worldview. There shouldn't be any opposing arguments that undermine your position in philosophy. These are called defeaters, and your worldview should be internally consistent. So hopefully that's not just like an information dump, but basically if I had to sum up this section, in case people weren't able to follow or it was a bit too fast, basically we want to compare naturalism and we want to compare atheism and we want to compare theism. And the way we'll make the comparison is we'll take a set of criteria that are indicative of a good explanation, and we'll simply just see when we evaluate the data which one does better. Does theism fare better in terms of these virtues, or does atheism fare better? And that's what they do in the sciences. So I think it's an established means of ascertaining explanations. So it's not not like a concocted method of arriving at the truth. Now, let me just make sure people didn't join later. Okay. So that's sort of the preliminary part of this. You have to set some standards for what a good explanation is. And then now we'll turn to the evidence that's relevant and the data that's relevant. So there's various features about our world that are actually quite interesting in the light of scientific discoveries. We know that we live in a world that has like parameters or constants, like physical constants that are basically finely tuned so that it allows for life. We know that we have conscious beings. We have not only do we have conscious beings, we have embodied moral agents that have religious intuitions, and we sort of take that for granted. But if you actually look at the empirical knowledge that we have, it's actually very amazing that we actually live in a world that is inhabited by like agents with the capacity to think rationally, with the ability to contemplate God, and have consciousness, and more specifically, like a first-person reflexive awareness of their own mental states. Like all this on naturalism, as I'll show, is actually, or all this is actually very surprising information in the light of scientific discoveries, and it's very unlikely and unexpected if there was no supreme power, supreme being in charge. So now we'll turn to the evidence. First is what philosophers and cosmologists call fine-tuning. I think most people, even if they're not well-versed in philosophy or cosmology, have probably heard arguments like these. As the argument goes, that there's various aspects of our world, and if any of these constants were different than they were, then our world would just be inhospitable for life. And I'll run through some of them. One of them is the strength of gravity. So if the strength of gravity was weaker than it was, you wouldn't have galaxies, you wouldn't have stars, you wouldn't have planets, and without these, life couldn't have arisen. If gravity had been weaker, then stars like the sun would be colder, and then you wouldn't be able to get the elements necessary for life. So the constant that gravity takes on is very delicately balanced. If it fell outside of a certain range, then we just wouldn't be able to have life. Then there's the strength of the strong nuclear force, one of the fundamental forces in physics. If it had been about more than 50% stronger, then almost all hydrogen would have been burnt out. We wouldn't have life. If it were weaker, then we wouldn't have much elements beyond hydrogen, and again, we wouldn't be able to have life. And the parameters are quite fine. If it was greater by 0.4%, which is very small, we'd have a bunch of carbon, no oxygen, couldn't have life. If it was weaker by 0.4, we'd have a bunch of oxygen, but no carbon, again, couldn't have life. You have the strength of the weak nuclear force. If it was weaker by a factor of 10, we would have had a lot more neutrons in our universe, and then we would have had a lot of helium and stars that depend on burning hydrogen would basically not be able to function. We wouldn't have life. There's fine-tuning of the masses of fundamental particles. There's different elementary particles, and it's a similar thing. If the values that they took on were different than they were, and fell outside of a certain sort of precise range, then we wouldn't be able to have life. There's actually lots of examples. There's the initial entropy of the universe, the initial mass energy density of the universe. There's non-uniformity. A lot of different things in our universe had to go right for us to have a universe that permits life. The thing about it, it's very fine-tuned. So these ranges that different values in our universe take on, they call it fine-tuned because as soon as you get outside, it's like boom, you have no life. And this is generally used as an argument for God's existence because it raises the question: why do the values have the values that they have? Is it a matter of an agent making the values take on the values that they have? Is it a matter of unguided processes? Is it a matter of chance? Is it a matter of just somehow necessity? Like somehow it's a matter of that's how the world is and that's how it is. And when you go through the different options that are there, if atheism is true and there's no God, it doesn't really make sense why these values would just be necessary and that's the way they were. It's kind of it's a fact that is in need of further explanation. And if these values arise because of chance, it's just simply a happy coincidence that they are what they are, then that's an extremely, extremely, extremely low chance of it happening. Whereas if there's a supernatural agent like God and he's deliberately making this universe so that it can promote life, then that's actually the most likely explanation out of all the options we have available to us. But that's just one feature of our universe. So not only do we have a universe that permits life, we also have a universe that has life to begin with. And so recently there's been it's been ongoing, some interest in origin of life research. And the more we learn about the origins of life, the more we realize how incredible it is that life arose in the first place. And I would recommend this book called Stairway to Life, An Origin of Life Reality Check. It's a very good book that details the various steps that have to occur in order for life to arise. And you just read through it and it's absolutely amazing how incredibly rare it is that our universe actually has life to begin with. It mentions these different steps. I can go through some of them. One is the formation and concentration of building blocks. So the building blocks of life are like amino acids and proteins. And in order to have life, you have to have these building blocks in a very pure form. When scientists are in the lab and they're manipulating compounds and they're just trying to synthesize chemicals together, they're working with very pure compounds. But in nature, you don't always get that. You can't really guarantee that you have the pure compounds you need. So the fact that in order to get life going in the first place. You need these pure compounds, and that itself is a challenge. It's an obstacle that has to be overcome, and it's not something that is necessarily very probable. Once you have those building blocks, then you know, like there's this thing called homochirality. It's basically molecules are aligned in a certain way, and it's not that you can just have like the building blocks of proteins are called amino acids, and it's not that you can just like put together a bunch of amino acids in any way you want. They actually have to be aligned in a very specific way. So to get life, you have to have these building blocks be arranged in a precise way, and that itself is another obstacle. Then there's what's like the water paradox. So life requires water, but it's very hard to have any type of like chemical synthesis going on in the presence of water. So that's also sort of a mystery, and it's an obstacle that needs to be overcome. And there's all sorts of other, you know, maybe I don't necessarily need to go through all these things. You can check out this book if you wanted to read more about it. But you know, there's things like the interdependency of DNA, RNA, and proteins. Like we have all these chicken and egg problems in biology and chemistry. Like in order to get proteins, like what do you need? You need DNA. But in order to get DNA, like what do you need? You need proteins. So it's like in order to get one thing, you need another thing. In order to get that other thing, you need you know, the first thing. So it's like all these sorts of chicken and egg problems. Like you need, you know, yeah, it's like very problematic. If you don't have proteins in the first place, then you can't have the mechanisms by which you can produce proteins. So, you know, that's a challenge for origin of life. And then, so let's say, okay, so now we've gone through fine tuning, and we've gone through, although very briefly, and we've gone through how hard it is to get life. Now let's say we have life. We still have to account for consciousness. And that's also problematic because we don't know how consciousness arises. And let's say that there is some sort of atheistic explanation for consciousness. We still don't know how likely it is that the consciousness that we see in this world would even arise. You know, by consciousness, I take it to mean like a first-person reflexive awareness of our mental states. So not only am I having certain thoughts, I'm also aware of these thoughts. And the thing is, if there's no God and everything is just unguided natural processes, you know, who's to say that we couldn't just, you know, who's to say that we would just like lack consciousness altogether? Like maybe things could have happened differently, and instead of having consciousness, we would just be like robots responding to our environment. You know, instead of being aware and having things like beliefs, feelings, and desires, we could simply just be like responding to our environment in just like very robotic ways. And you might say that, well, the reason we have this type of first-person reflexive awareness is because of you know, evolution and natural selection, and it's more evolutionary advantageous for us to be aware of our different mental states. But you know, I think it's actually more advantageous to just be robots responding to our environment, because we have consciousness, we have things like feelings, beliefs, and desires, and these things actually lead us to very destructive behavior. You know, I think if you wanted to have some species survive on this planet, it'd be better for them to just have like, you know, a robot-like behavior and just simply do what they need to survive in their environment. It's when you introduce things like, you know, desires, then you get all sorts of destructive tendencies that are actually counterproductive to survival. And then on top of that, okay, let's say you have conscious living beings. There's still no guarantee that you would get embodied moral agents with religious intuitions. You know, there's atheistic explanations for why we have religious intuitions. They say that, you know, as we evolved, we have this like hyperactive agency detection device. Like when we see a rustling in the trees, we attribute it to an agency because it was beneficial for our survival. You know, there's all sorts of atheistic explanations for why we have religious intuitions. But actually, if there's, you know, no God in charge and things are happening as a matter of chance and maybe some natural processes, it's really unclear how likely it would be that you would actually have living beings with religious intuitions. You know, you can imagine various possible worlds or possible circumstances where you have living beings evolved and they don't require religious intuitions in order to have increased fitness. So the fact that we have religious intuitions is not necessarily all that likely if there's no God in charge. So, I mean, I briefly presented some pieces of evidence that uh, are sort of indicative of higher reality out there, um, and some very puzzling features of our world. So now the question arises, what is more virtuous in terms of the theoretical virtues I mentioned earlier? Is naturalism more virtuous, or is theism more virtuous? And I would argue that if naturalism is not very virtuous, because if we go to these um, different features, like our world being what it is, having these different features, is not at all likely under naturalism. So it doesn't do well in terms of likeliness. It's also unclear how it does in terms of causal adequacy. I mean, atheism, it's very hard to explain how life can arise, especially because you have all these chicken and egg problems. It's very unclear that if atheism is true, that you would have life arise. It's unclear whether you have consciousness arise in the first place. There's a lot of unanswered questions with atheism as far as how effective it is at being able to cause different things. As far as consistency with basic principles of rationality, there are some actually quite prominent atheists that they realize how improbable it is that our life arises, so they make all sorts of added hypotheses and speculations to try to explain things. Some of them say that, well, it's just like our world, the constants that they take on, it's just like necessary. But as I mentioned earlier, if we have an explanation for something in terms of an agent, we should prefer that over to saying that it's necessary or that it exists uncaused. So it doesn't do well in terms of consistency with basic principles of rationality either. And then there's other things which maybe are not so threatening to atheism. But when you look at theism, our world is very likely under theism because we know that there's a God, we know that there's Krishna, and we know his intentions. We know that Krishna wants souls to develop a loving relationship with him. We know that Krishna makes this place as a moral stage where we can come to love God. So we know that God would want to make a world that has embodied moral agents, that have religious intuitions, that could know and love him. And that we know that Krishna, being all-loving, it would be extremely likely that he would make a world like this to occur because Krishna does actions that lead to the greatest good, and making a world such as ours that has embodied moral agents with religious intuitions is something that leads to the greatest good. So we do very well in terms of likeliness. We also do very well in terms of causal adequacy because Krishna is all-powerful, he can do anything, and even in origin of life studies, when scientists are able to maybe synthesize synthesize complex molecules, synthesize precursors to life, synthesize all sorts of things. It's the way they do it is they have an intelligent agent who's interacting with matter, and he brings about a complex result. So God is the most intelligent person, and on our tradition, he has the ability to interact with matter. So it's very intuitive that Krishna would be able to make life arise. He'd be able to make consciousness arise because we have things like the soul. The soul is one explanation for consciousness. There might be some objections to that, but that's maybe something we can get into later. And it's maybe there's some objections, like there's the problem of evil, which is one thing that the atheist might be able to use to undermine theism. But my last talk on this group, I mentioned why that's also not so much of a problem on our view. So when you weigh these different theoretical virtues, I would say that our tradition actually does very well. It's the science actually points towards God, because when you analyze this world, it just ends up being the case that theism is a better explanation for the data than atheism. So with that in place, it might be also worth responding to some typical objections that people raise against this type of view. One is that the weak anthropic principle. Basically, this is like what this principle states is that like we wouldn't be around to observe anything if we didn't exist. So like maybe there's all sorts of universes that don't have conscious observers, but the universes that do have conscious observers, the universes that do have conscious observers, well, naturally you'd expect that they'd be like conscious observers to observe things, or it's sort of described as like a selection effect. So, like if you have a really small door in your house that's like 4 feet tall, then you'll naturally think that like everyone in the world is 4 feet tall because the only people that are actually coming to your house and entering it are ones that can fit through that small door. So they would say that this weak anthropic principle is like there's like a selection effect going on. Like we would only exist as conscious observers in these worlds where the conditions are right for our existence. So that's one type of objection that people raise. I maybe didn't explain that as well as I could, but that's sort of the basic principle behind it. Then the very common one is the multiverse hypothesis. So, you know, people are aware that our existence is incredibly improbable if there's no God. So what they have basically, I mean, maybe there's some empirical evidence for the multiverse now, but you know, people say that, well, our universe is just one of like infinite universes, and if you have infinite universes, you know, even if it's improbable that you have a universe with life, like given infinite universes, like some of them are bound to have, like, you know, these really improbable conditions, and we just happen to find ourselves in one of those, you know, rare universes. That's one of the typical objections, but I don't think these are very convincing objections. So imagine, like, I think an analogy can sort of put things in a good perspective. So, like, imagine you like see a rich person in front of you. Now, you know that like millions of people have played the lottery, and even though it's really improbable that someone wins the lottery, like given how many people have played it, it's bound to happen that at least, you know, a few people have won the lottery. So there's a live possibility that the rich person in front of you has gotten his wealth because they won the lottery. However, our intuitions tell us that there's a better explanation available. You know, it's a much better explanation that the person who's rich, maybe he inherited it from his parents, maybe he worked hard to get his money. In any case, there's a better explanation than just like a chance explanation that he just happened to win the lottery. So explaining our existence by means of this multiverse hypothesis and this weak anthropic principle is like very similar to trying to explain the existence of the rich person in front of you, or the existence, like why he's rich in terms of winning the lottery. Like maybe it's one possible option, but there's better alternatives available. And I would say that the best explanation for our universe having the conditions that it does is that there's Krishna, there's God, and he's brought it about to be like this. And also, you know, adding a bunch of different universes on top of this one, like positing all these different universes, the important set of data is that this universe in particular has all these different features. And simply adding a bunch of universes doesn't actually make it any more likely that this universe would have the conditions that it does. Naturalism or atheism is true. Like you know, these different objections don't actually do anything to make it more likely that our universe would be like it is if atheism is true. So that's, I would say, a brief, I think I've been talking for about 30 minutes. Now, hopefully that wasn't a total information dump. It's probably a lot to take in, but I tried to summarize things as well as I could. Yeah, I can answer any questions if people have any, or maybe clarify some things that I might have gone over quickly, or explain things that I might have sort of just covered very briefly at the beginning.
Thank you very much, Adi. First of all, I want to say congratulations on a really nicely structured and presented argument. I was really, I was personally kind of amazed at how systematically we can present this kind of argument, and the amount of research that you put into it. I definitely think, as you suggested, if you could do more research on this, I think it would be a really valuable contribution. But thank you for taking the time and a very nice presentation. I already saw Rupa Vilas. you had your hand up, so I'll open up for questions. Maybe unless someone needs the slides, maybe we could close it for now, so we could see each other better, and then we can open up the slides, the notes, if anyone wants to refer back to them.
Okay, yeah, that's good.
Just as a preamble, I remember years ago reading one of Sariputa's publications where he did a sort of statistical, not a statistical, but an analysis about chance, about what are the chances of this universe coming together, as you say, by chance or by accident. And he said mathematical probability was so astoundingly unlikely as to be ridiculous.
Yeah.
Or words to that effect, anyway. Now, here's the question. Let's suppose a fairly intelligent, reasonably intelligent person who has an atheistic point of view or a naturalistic point of view says, "Well, all right. Theoretically, I want to think about, at least consider your theory that there's a creator." Then when I look at the things that are going on, that I'm aware of that are going on, and I remember hearing this, and I might have mentioned this before, Stephen Fry, I remember hearing him give a talk where he was saying that there's some disease that children get by bathing in the Nile River, where it goes into their eyes and they become blind. And he says, if there is a God, and I don't want anything to do with him. So in other words, how do you answer the challenge that people, seem to make quite a bit is, well, okay, let's say theoretically there's a God, but then why is this place such a horrible mess and so many tragic and horrible things are taking place, it seems almost on a constant basis. So that gives them pause, and that really makes them think, well, if it's true, then I don't like him, kind of response.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's basically the problem of evil, and that's basically my doctoral dissertation. And I've explained it before, but basically, in a nutshell, suffering and things like that exist because of free will. And one of the root reasons for suffering is that we originally, at least according to a pretty reasonable interpretation of Prabhupada, we were with Krishna in the spiritual world, and for one reason or other, maybe it was curiosity, we decided to come here to this world, and our highest happiness is to be with Krishna. But Krishna can't force us to come back to him, so he structures this world as like a moral stage where we can learn various lessons and eventually come to learn that our happiness is with Krishna. So this world isn't designed to be like a hedonistic paradise. It's not meant to be like this utopia where everything is perfect. It's in one sense, it's perfect. The Ishopanishad says that this world is perfect and complete. But this world has a specific purpose, and that purpose is to turn us back towards God and to allow us to realize that our real happiness is to be with God. So the reason we have different suffering and different ailments in this world is because we would explain that also through the law of karma. But ultimately, the underlying purpose is that Krishna wants us to learn that this world is not our home and that our real happiness is with him. So if, I think one problematic thing, some people have this conception of the world as it's meant to be like this paradise. But, this world, it's nice, it has its nice features, but it's better viewed as like a correctional facility that's meant to teach us to turn back to God. So when we have things that are sort of very gruesome and painful, like it's very jarring, yes, but we can understand in the greater light of things that it's because this world is oriented towards teaching us lessons, and sometimes those lessons might be to become detached from this world. Sometimes that might require pain, and it's painful in the moment, but it works out in the end because it ultimately takes us back to Krishna, where we enjoy the highest happiness. So that's one response to that.
Thank you very much, Adi. Any other comments on that one? Jagat Panama?
then God doesn't really leave us with a realistic option. Either you love me, or I'll send you to prison or torture till you confess you want to get back to me.
Yeah, I guess there's a third option, and that's the Brahma Jyoti. If we don't want to suffer and we don't want to be with God, we have that option available to us. But it's also, I think Prabhupada was asked, like, why does Krishna create this material world? And Prabhupada's response was very clever. He said, Krishna doesn't create this world, you created this world. All Krishna does is basically give you a place for you to act out your desires. So in one sense, he's not even really forcing us to come here, and he's not forcing us to suffer. You know, he just basically gives us what we desire. But he does so in a way that, he creates this world, but it's structured by certain laws of justice to keep things civil and to ultimately allow us to learn our lessons. But it's done in a way that it doesn't rob us of our free will. We still have our free will. So, it's maybe not so much like Krishna's forcing us, but, he basically just gives us our free will. He facilitates the ability for us to act on our choices, and this world is what it is because ultimately of our desire.
Thanks. On the other overall issue, this discussion, or whether there is a God, or even be more specific, there is Krishna, or there is random, natural selection, chance. Isn't that a false dichotomy? There is many more options that have been put forward throughout history. Why we get bogged down in this false dichotomy?
I guess one reason is that these are two very common, prevalent viewpoints. So the sort of strategy I have for choosing the best explanation, you could apply it to any number of viewpoints. You could consider all the different views that have been put forward. But I chose atheism and theism because I think it's at least a very common view nowadays that there's no God, there's just these unguided, well, maybe not unguided, there's evolution, natural selection, all these things. It's there are other views. There are some sort of philosophers that have a whole wide spectrum of views, but I've chosen maybe two of the most common views and just see how they stack in relationship to each other. You could apply the same process to of like abductive reasoning and comparing theoretical virtues with any number of different theories, though.
Because there's a big jump between, say, okay, even though I will accept that, it's basically mathematically impossible for life to arise by chance, mathematically impossible. But why are you making this massive jump from there to say, therefore, Krishna is the supreme personality of Godhead and enjoys with the gopis in Vrindavan and so on and so forth? There is a massive thing in between. It's a massive jump you're doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess maybe it's sort of like, well, we have our theological framework and we have a certain set of scriptures and a certain set of doctrines, and that's been passed down to us through disciplic succession and through scripture. And this process is maybe just a way of saying, okay, we have our tradition, we have our beliefs. Let's see how it explains reality. How well does it explain reality? And we can take our tradition, we can compare it to other different views, and we can say, well, look, actually, our tradition, you may find it irrational, but if you actually take a more scientific approach, actually, our tradition does a very good job of explaining reality. If you have a better explanation of reality, then, you can put it forward. We'd like to hear it, but ours does quite well. That's maybe one response.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's a really nice response, Adi. I really like that. I was going to ask something, but I thought, did I see Ramananda's hand go up?
You first, Sankarsana.
Mine was just a simple one on there was one point where you talked about uncaused things. You said certain kinds of facts demand an explanation. I was really I was really, what's the word? I was persuaded by that. And I recall once having a not quite the same discussion, but a similar discussion with a friend, and a similar point came up about things that need explanations, and they made a point that just, I think, if I remember correctly, just postulating something like God or soul doesn't offer the explanation, because it's sort of like a kind of like a tag or a black box that doesn't explain anything. It just says, it just gives a name to the gap. Something like what a scientist might do when they postulate something like dark matter in the universe that no one is able to see or investigate. You just postulate it because there is a gap that can't be explained unless you postulate some other entity. But that thing isn't doing any explanation. It's just filling a gap. And no one knows how to scientifically account for it, I think. I mean, I'm not so expert in that. But the point that this person made was that postulating a God or soul to explain some of these things that naturalism struggles to explain isn't doing any better, because, say, for example, you do have a soul, you still can't explain how the soul is interacting with matter. You still can't explain how, you end up with the same problems. You just named it differently.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. So I think it's still doing some explanatory work when you posit God, because it's like, okay, what is why is our world the way it is? Okay, like, okay, maybe to backtrack, like, it's a common like new atheist rhetoric to say that there's no evidence for God. You hear that common, but that's very false. Like, anything that raises the probability of a certain thesis or hypothesis is evidence. So if you have like two jars of jelly beans, one has 8 green jelly beans and 2 blue jelly beans, the other has 8 blue jelly beans and 2 green jelly beans. I hope I got those right. And you get a green jelly bean. Like, that's good evidence that you got the jar that has 8 green jelly beans. So that itself is like, you have some body of data that provides evidence for some sort of thesis or hypothesis. So the data that I've listed, fine-tuning, consciousness, biogenesis, it's in one sense evidence for God, because it raises the probability that God exists. So before we introduce this evidence, maybe you assign a certain probability to God's existence, like whatever it is. Now, when you add this data into the equation, all of a sudden it's far more likely that God exists given this data. So that's sort of one response, is that it does, when you have all this data and you're trying to reach an explanation, you look for the most probable explanation, or the one that's the best, most likely, or fares better in terms of these virtues, or more probable. And God is actually a good explanation for all these things, because it's very probable hypothesis under this data. Now, granted, that also, you posit God, maybe it's not so much that it doesn't do any explanatory work, but it comes with its own set of challenges at that point. Like with the soul, you have to account for how does the soul, which is a spiritual entity, interact with matter. You have to maybe explain how God, who's a spiritual, non-material being, can interact with matter. And it's maybe not so much that positing these things don't do any explanatory work, but they have their own set of challenges. And I think those challenges can be met. Our view on beta beta is very unique, because this material world and matter, it's one of God's energies. And so God is not wholly distinct from it. So you don't have the question of how can two wholly distinct substances interact with each other. It's one sort of being, God, interacting with something that is, in one sense, connected with him. So it's not as mysterious on that view. Same with the soul. The Gita describes that the reason that the soul can interact with matter is because of super soul. So Krishna can interact with matter. He can also interact with the soul. He acts as a good causal bridge between the soul and matter, and whatever the soul desires, Krishna can use his powers to basically move matter in accord. He can basically the soul desires and the soul wills and the soul feels. If I desire to move my arm, then Krishna sees my desire and he, basically facilitates my desire by allowing my desires to have some sort of causal influence on matter. So we have explanations to these types of questions that can be met. Granted, when you posit the existence of God, it comes with its own set of challenges. But if you meet those challenges, then I think our view is a better explanation.
Thank you very much. Very nice answer. Ramananda, did you want to ask something?
Yes, thank you, Adi Purusa. Really nice, really interesting class, especially when you got to the biology part. I was getting excited then.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask about evolution theory and just to get your perspective on something like when someone gives the argument that, well, how I know, or there's good evidence for evolution because we can see how this adaptation suits the environment. So a particular physical adaptation, or perhaps we might say someone posits that consciousness is of some particular adaptive or selective advantage. It seems to me to be kind of going around in a circle. I don't, and I'd like to get your perspective on that. Is it possible to offer evidence for evolution theory based on what I perceive as being a selective advantage? Like how would I? Is it proven evolution theory, or is it what is it exactly? Because it doesn't seem like science to me. Science seems like I can very much test something and
I would say it's a theory, and I imagine that people find it a convincing theory because when you compare it to other theories, it does the best in terms of theoretical virtues. You could say that. The scientists that are promoting evolutionary theory, they would say it fits with the data. It has good predictive fruitfulness. Like we can make successful predictions based off this theory. Has good like explanatory scope. It explains a wide variety of phenomenon. So they would probably say that it's a theory, but when you look at the data, it's a theory that explains the data well. But there are still some issues. Like like evolutionary theory doesn't explain the origin of life. You can only have life. You can only have evolution and natural selection take place once you have life in the first place. But it doesn't actually account for life itself. And there's a large growing number of Christians that they affirm evolution, but they say it's guided by God, and it's more likely that we would have the data that we see if God guided evolution than if God didn't guide evolution. So there's maybe multiple ways of interpreting the data. An atheistic evolutionary theory is one of them, but you could say that there's arguably better options available.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's a big topic, isn't it? And I know what you mean. So I've seen some philosophers of science really hone in on that question of there's two questions: where did the first cell come from, and then and then how did that evolve into various different multicellular organisms? But I think what struck me was your explanation of the protein and DNA. The DNA is required in order to make certain proteins, enzymes, and they are required in order to, help in terms of certain things with the DNA, like repairing and things like that. So it's this loop, like you said.
Chicken.
I hear that now. It's and how do you get out of that? I've heard some people say nowadays that I've read some papers a year ago. So basically, it's we've gone from the idea of DNA first, a protein first, RNA first. Now it's just all at once. We just have to accept it all came at once, which it's honest at least.
I think RNA first was like a common theory, but there's a good book. The book I referenced, what is it? Stairway to Life. It's pretty recent, and I think he addresses some of the recent theories, and he shows that there's still like lots of problems.
Okay.
It's a very good book. I highly recommend devotees to check it out.
Check that out.
Stairway to Life. It's I'm not always actually such a fan of certain like intelligent design people, like, sometimes I think that their arguments are a little bit problematic, or they're not quite so charitable in how they characterize the opposition, or maybe they take some shortcuts, or they could be more rigorous. But this is like a very, I would highly recommend this. It just like really outlines the steps life has to take and shows the problems with like all the different problems with some of the common theories of the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jacob Holland, did you raise your hand? You're on mute, by the way.
Looking from a layman who knows very little about science, biology, evolution, all this technical issue, for me, it looks exactly the same argument to the reverse. Just like the fact that is practically statistically impossible for life to come about by chance, because that is the fact that is impossible does not, you don't have to jump all the way. That doesn't constitute strong evidence that Krishna is the absolute truth and that he dances with the gopis in Vrindavan. Reversing the argument, the fact that there seems to be obviously some level of evolution, there is some evolution going on, that does not disprove that there is some absolute truth, or you can call it God, in a broader sense, that this evolution is part of. Do you see my point? It's the same argument reverse. They're jumping, they're doing one in jumping, very long jump one way, the other they're jumping along the other way.
Yeah, I guess I like to frame this in terms of what's the best explanation. So, the fact that there's evolution doesn't disprove that there's a God. The fact that things are improbable doesn't disprove that atheism's true. But I think if you're trying to evaluate what worldview has the best explanation, these facts do play a role. And, I think the best explanation would be able to make sense of both. Like, why is there a world that is structured by these, evolutionary mechanisms? Why is there a world where these, it's very improbable that life would arise? I think maybe the best solution is to find the explanation that makes the best sense of all the different facets of our existence. And it may not be necessarily true, but at least, all we can really do at the end of the day is do things based on what we find to be the best explanation.
But wouldn't this be, rather than the best, the least worse? They're both very wide approximation, that one is less worse than the other.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, I guess abductive reasoning, it's not perfect, but I guess it's like sometimes all you can do is go with the theory that it makes the most sense out of the data you have at the time. Even a lot of scientific theories, we may not be like bulletproof, but scientists accept them because it's the best thing that we've got at the moment. So
thank you.
I think Rupa Vilas.
Oh, sorry, Rupa Vilas. I was on mute. Apologies.
Well, I was very struck by the beginning of your discussion where we didn't get a chance to really go through it step by step. All of the kind of things that had to be in place in order for life to arise. You were kind of making almost a list of all the things that need to be in place in order for it to take place.
Yeah.
Which means that which the indication from that, I know it's maybe standard intelligent design theory, but if all those things had to be in place, that means it was an arrangement.
Yeah.
Now, if you say a very complex arrangement, I mean, probably just to give so many examples of, if you see something on the street like a machine, of complex machine, and you say, oh, this came about by chance, everyone will laugh in your face.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when there's an arrangement, that's an indication there's an arranger.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that that's the strength of the theistic argument that you make, is that all these amazing things have to be in place and working together in order for there to be, conscious existence.
Yeah, it's a good way of looking at it. It's
I mean,
complex and
maybe simplistic, I don't know, but it just, to me, it is the best type of argument to say that when there's a very complex arrangement, we don't think of it as an accident.
Yeah, that's, I think, historically the type of lines of reasoning that have been employed with like complex life. I think like the history of it is like William Paley said, look at this world, like we have such complicated things. It's like a watch. When you see a watch, you think that okay, someone designed this watch, and you look at life, and it's obvious that it's so complex. Someone had to design it, and then like the counter response is that well, like there's disanalogies between a watch and a biological organism. The main one being that we have mechanisms in place that can explain how these biological organisms be. We don't have really mechanisms in place aside from a person that can explain a watch, so they're sort of disanalogous. But I think I think people haven't really caught on to abiogenesis and the origin of life so much, at least in like philosophy. So I think the argument works well in that case because we don't really the mechanisms in place for explaining life are still not such not the most compelling explanation.
But
Yeah,
Go ahead, Jacob.
hasn't Hume refuted that argument very comprehensively, very convincingly?
yeah. Hume refuted it. I mean, I think there's been some counter responses to Hume. I mean, yeah, there's some of the arguments. It's like, well, why assume that there's like one designer? It could be a committee of designers. Why we don't know the reasons why a designer would want to design things. I mean, I think there have been good. I don't know if I would say it's a refutation. He's given some good responses, and it's sort of it quieted the discussion for a while. But now, with recent advances in like microbiology, I think um, there's still strong arguments of these types, but they're sort of shifted in the way that they've been presented, and they maybe focus on different features of our world.
If I could just add on to that, I did you may not know this, Adi, but I did a talk. I think it must have been last week or the week before.
Last week. I did sort of go through that very quickly, but not in super depth.
Yeah, and I came across these same points that you're raising, and like I'm amazed how well read you are about it, because it was when I did this presentation last week or the week before. It was the first time I studied the topic, and what struck me was the point that you just made, was also what I learned, which is that Paley's watchmaker argument, that watchmaker analogy for postulating a god, the existence of a god based on design. It's true that Hume undermined that argument, but the modern reincarnation of that design argument, as you've said, it doesn't take the analogical form. It focuses on the things that you talked about today, which is all these very irreducibility of certain complex biological systems and that sort of things, which it's not focusing on the analogy like the watch. It's focusing more on established scientific concerns about life and so forth, and consciousness and so forth, and uses that to infer design, which is
there's certain reason I didn't quite get into them why I chose abductive reasoning over deductive or inductive. Like Paley's argument was more of an inductive reasoning based on analogy, and the way you discredit an inductive argument, one of the ways is to show that, well, especially analogical arguments, you basically show that the thing that you're trying to draw an analogy, that you basically show that the analogy is like not good in some way, like you're saying that X is like Y. One way to discount an analogical argument to say, well, actually X is not like Y. I think that's why inductive arguments have been tough in this field, but I like abductive arguments for a number of different reasons. There's also, if you get a little bit more technical, like statisticians use this theorem called Bayes' theorem. Maybe I don't need to get into that there, but one of the problems is like, maybe Sankarshan knows this, like there's the problem of prior probabilities. Like in order to calculate the probability of things, you need to know like sort of what's called the prior probabilities, and those type of approaches are problematic for these. So abductive reasoning is a good way to, I think when you use an abductive reasoning approach, one, it's like what scientists use, and two, you can make the strongest case for these arguments with that style.
Thank you. What I wanted to say, you reminded me of Ramanujacharya in one of your comments, because I read recently how Ramanujacharya was not impressed by the design argument, actually.
Yeah,
He
what
rejected
people
it.
don't know is that he had the same arguments that David Hume had, just like beat him by like several hundred years.
Yeah.
I think Ramanuja, he was against the idea of trying to know God just through logic, and his position was that we had to know God through scripture. And I sort of try to stay true to Ramanuja's approach, because I'm not so much trying to use logic and empirical observation to try to show the existence of God, but I'm saying, okay, we already know, well, maybe not know, we have a model of God based on scripture, and we can use this approach to show that this model of God that we've gotten through scripture is a better explanation than competing worldviews. So that way we remain true to scripture.
Thank you. Thank you. I just thought it shows the richness of the tradition, isn't it? Even the great acharyas within the tradition, you might think they would be all over the design argument, but actually through intellectual honesty, they were like, no, this doesn't work. I want to call on Rupa Velasquez. He had his hand up for a while and I interrupted, and then Jagat Palana, and I thought Ramananda third.
Well, could you just review again? I know that you've already done it, but as you say, I didn't think of it as a dump, but it was hard for me to follow. Perhaps I would have liked to. But abductive reasoning, I'm still not quite sure I know what that is.
Okay.
You just reviewed that.
Should I pull up the document? Maybe it'll help. Maybe it'll. So basically, when scientists compare theories, they take into account a number of theoretical virtues. So some theoretical virtues include simplicity. You know, the fewer sort of items you have in your theory, the more likely it is to be true, all else being equal. There's things like predictive fruitfulness. So if a theory allows you to make successful predictions, that's like a theoretical virtue. There's things like goodness of fit, like how well does your theory like fit with the data. There's explanatory scope, like does your theory explain certain things well. So these are all what we would call theoretical virtues. And when you're choosing between different theories, you want to choose the theory that basically has the most theoretical virtues or does the best in terms of its theoretical virtues. So all else being equal, you should choose a theory that allows you to make successful predictions. Or all else being equal, you should choose a theory that fits best with the data. And it can be a bit tricky because sometimes in theories, one may do better in terms of like simplicity, one may do better in terms of predictive fruitfulness. So it can be a little bit problematic at times. But if you have a theory and it's simpler, it has more predictive fruitfulness, it explains the data better, it fits with the data better, you should prefer that to a theory that isn't as simple, it doesn't allow you to make successful predictions, doesn't fit well with the data. So abductive reasoning is also called inference to the best explanation. Basically, make an inference to what you think is the best explanation based on how well your theories do in terms of various what we call theoretical virtues.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you. Jagat Palana, did you have your hand up as well?
Going back to Ramanuja. But if then our sources then is scriptures following Ramanuja's footstep, then what we do is theology. And to call that either anything other than theology, either philosophy or science, we are stretching it. We are stretching the definition of what constitutes science and philosophy. Because what it is theology. Theology is not, and is never been irrational, unscientific. There's not that when you start doing theology, you're just speaking all kind of nonsense. In theology, 2 + 2 is 5. Theology is very rational, very scientific, but it's theology.
Yeah. I would still count this as theology, but I think the approach, at least as far as reasoning, the reasoning approach of abductive reasoning, I think it can be employed within theological contexts, but it does have to be modified slightly in the sense that, like in science, generally simplicity is a virtue. Some a theory that is simpler tends to do better. In theology, or when you're comparing like, you know, philosophical positions or you're doing theology, it's not clear that simplicity is a virtue. So my approach is slightly modified in that I basically identify things that are virtuous in like theological or philosophical contexts and use those as virtues rather than import the ones wholesale from the sciences. So yeah, I guess that would be my approach. I mean, even philosophy uses abductive reasoning. I mean, I'm sure in theology, if you're trying to, well, maybe not theology, maybe in terms of like, well, even if you're, I don't know, trying to arrive at like the best scriptural interpretation of something, you bring in hermeneutics, there's probably some sense in which you're making an inference to the best explanation because the, you know, you can have a, you know, you can support any of two readings based on like scripture. So you need some set of criteria in which you choose the one that's the best reading or the better reading of scripture. And that will probably involve some sort of inference to the best explanation based on a number of considerations. So I think as long as we make sure to use virtues that are conducive to the truth in the context of which we're doing our inquiry, then it's a good approach.
Thank you.
And Adi, you maybe correct me if you had if it's not, if this isn't so right, but the impression I got from Ramanuja was that his own position was theological, was when he was arguing within, you know, arguing to promote certain of his own theories, then it was theological because it was appealing to scriptural sources and so forth. But when he was defending it against opposing views, for say from the Advaitic tradition, or probably even against the Buddhists and so forth, I wouldn't have. The impression I had was that was much more philosophical rather than theological, because in those cases he wasn't appealing to scripture. He was objecting to their views on their own terms. So it was very he was known for that philosophy, isn't it?
Yeah, Ramanuja and all the other acharyas, like everything they do is not, well, this is true because the Bhagavad Gita says it. You know, they're, you know, like Ramanuja's critique of Advaita is largely, you know, like philosophical. He's pointing out inconsistencies and he doesn't need to appeal to scripture to make those claims. Yeah, I mean, that's why, like, the line between theology and philosophy can sometimes get a little bit fuzzy. Like, even if you do theology, you end up having to do, like, some bit of philosophy here and there. Yeah.
Well, I still think that you are the perfect blend of all of them, Adi. Congratulations on a very wonderful talk.
Thank you.
No doubt. Sadhu, sadhu.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you everyone else for attending and having making nice contributions. And
as Shyamasunder says, go for the rhinoceros. You know.
Yeah, we wish you all success, Adi. And please come back again and do more talks.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Okay. Hare Krishna, everyone. Have a good evening
Thank you.
and a good weekend.